Okay, everyone, welcome back to class, and I am excited to get things moving again. I hope you're feeling at least settled a little bit. I can't even imagine what this is like for you. And so I want to start by saying please reach out to whoever you feel can help you. If you need any help, if that's me, please reach out. If it's someone else, reach out to them. But the best thing we can do right now is stay connected to each other. So I've got a video here where I'm going to talk about biodiversity today. I'm excited because we're moving into ecology. This is one of my most favorite areas of study in biology. Ecology is the study of the relationship between organisms. I'll get more into that. But today I want to focus on biodiversity. We're going to be talking about what biodiversity is, how biodiversity is measured, the patterns of biodiversity in nature, and then the assignment that you'll have to do is related to the benefits of biodiversity and what we can do to preserve biodiversity. Before we get to that, though, I have a little lecture about biodiversity. So, here we go. I'm going to switch over to that. And again, I'm still new to this, so if you have any suggestions about how this can go better, please let me know. So, biodiversity, at its very basic definition, is the number and variety of living organisms. So when we talk about variety, we're talking about genetic diversity, we're talking about species diversity, and we're talking about ecosystem diversity, right? And the idea of diversity is just that you have as many different things as you possibly can in whichever category you're talking about. So genetic diversity is the most basic element of all of this, right? So there are millions of different combinations of genes that exist in the organisms on Earth, right? We have diversity, genetic diversity between and within different species. We have diversity between and within population. And we even have diversity between different individuals within a population. If you want to look at diversity within individuals, look up chimeras. But I'm going to keep moving. So genetic diversity is measured using DNA sequences, but also can be used observing different phenotypes. So going out there and seeing all of the variety within a species can be measured by looking at phenotypes. One of the important things to note is that genetic diversity is the raw material for evolution, right? So mutations create the variability that is needed for new species to arise. And the really interesting thing to think about is that evolution has tended towards more diversity. There have been events that have reduced the amount of genetic and biodiversity, but overall, went from one single species to the millions that we see on Earth today, right? Another area where evolution has tended towards more diversity is human evolution. I've showed this map before, but we went from one ancestral population to the variety of different populations that we see on Earth today, and that is all a result of genetic diversity. Genetic diversity gives rise to species diversity, and the basic definition of that is the variety of species on Earth. We've gone over the idea that species can be challenging to define, all of the different definitions that can be used, but at the end of the day, we have different species and we have millions of different species on Earth. I think one of the things I want to point out is the bacterial diversity. We've found 4,000 different species of bacteria, but they predict that there could be 3 million species on Earth. Fungal diversity as well, only 70,000 species, but 1.5 million species have been described. Or are predicted to be on Earth. Even the insects, 950,000, almost a million species. They think there could be up to 100 million species of insects on Earth. So those are some areas of research that are desperately needed. If you're thinking about studying something interesting and worthwhile, think about bacteria, fungus, and insects. All right. The final form of biodiversity is ecosystem diversity. So that's just the variety of habitats and biological communities that are on Earth. What's really fascinating about this is that The more diversity you have with species, the more potential interactions between those species you have, and the higher potential for really interesting processes to occur within an ecosystem. So ecosystem diversity is driven by two different things: the species diversity that I just addressed and environmental diversity. So those are the abiotic factors like temperature and precipitation, but can also include things like salinity and altitude. All of these different abiotic factors combined with the species that live there create the ecosystem diversity that we see on Earth. Just as an example, this is a map of Africa that shows all of the different ecoregions or large ecosystem areas, and you can just see the different colors there represent each ecoregion, and we've got a large ecoregions in Africa. All right. So the next thing I want to talk about is how species biodiversity is measured. Right? It's measured with two different variables. One is species richness, which is the total number of species in an area. More species equals higher species richness. So we'll see over on the right, we've got two ecosystems which actually have the same species richness. They have 4 species. But the thing that separates these two photos on the side of the slide is that they have different levels of evenness. So evenness is the proportion of each species in a community, right? If they're equal proportions, you have a higher level of evenness. So the one on the top has a higher level of evenness than the one on the bottom, and you can see how that will affect the species that, the interactions between the species. A higher evenness means a higher variety of potential interactions and relationships between the species. All right, so the next thing that I want to talk about are the patterns of biodiversity in ecosystems. So we're going to start with pattern 1. The biodiversity tends to increase as you move towards the equator. So we've got this diagram here that shows as you move towards the equator, the number of species increases, right? So northern Canada has fewer species of birds than Central America. This also shows a similar idea, but it shows the equator being latitude 0. You'll see the highest number of species are at the equator, and as you move in either direction along the x-axis, you have a reduced number of bird species. All right, and this just lays it out plainly. The arrows point towards the poles and point towards a reduction in species diversity. The second pattern that I want to talk about is that biodiversity increases with area up to a certain point. You'll notice there's kind of a leveling out in each of these graphs. Here we've got continental diversity. So as you increase the size of the ecosystem, you get a increase in species. Again, though, up to a point. All right. Here's a map of the Galapagos Islands. The larger islands have greater species diversity. And this just shows an idea that's particularly important when you're sampling an ecology. If you want to get a true picture of species diversity, you need to sample the largest area possible. Now, the third pattern that I want to talk about is the idea that biodiversity is maximized at intermediate levels of disturbance. So this graph just shows that disturbance, something like earthquakes, hurricanes, forest fires, when you have frequent and large disturbances, you get a reduction in biodiversity. If you have infrequent and small disturbances, you have a reduction in biodiversity. But somewhere right in the middle, you have the maximized amount of biodiversity. This is actually an idea that some people are challenging, and is a good time for me to talk about how science is based on the available data, and what ideas people might think are true today might change. And so stay tuned for how that develops. All right, and this is just a quick review, right? Pattern 1, biodiversity increases as you move from the poles to the equator. Pattern 2, larger areas have more biodiversity and pattern 3, areas with intermediate levels of disturbance have the highest of biodiversity. So I want to wrap things up by talking about the benefits of biodiversity, the threats, and what's being done to preserve biodiversity. So I lay it out this way because there are people that are proposing the idea that biodiversity does not have any benefits. And so that would be considered a null hypothesis. And we need to provide evidence that biodiversity is actually beneficial. So one of the ways that we can divide up this idea of why biodiversity is important is into two categories. There are anthropocentric reasons biodiversity is important. So those are reasons that are important to people. And then there are biocentric reasons biodiversity is important. And those are reasons that are important to every other living thing out there, right? So the number of species interactions that are potential in the ecosystems and how they operate, that's a real biocentric reason for thinking about biodiversity as being important, right? There are lots of things going on in the forests, lots of things going on in the oceans that we don't even know about or care about, but they're important to the things that live there, and so it's important that we maintain biodiversity. Another reason biodiversity is important is as insurance against changes in the environment. I think one of the biggest examples is along the wetlands. As hurricanes get more intense, estuaries along the coast maintain a healthy environment, but then also protect us from those sorts of disturbances. So that's an anthropocentric reason. Genetic knowledge is a reason biodiversity is important. People often talk about how new medicines can be discovered from things that are in the rainforests, and we need to make sure that those things are available. I think another one is when it comes to our food supply, that the greater variety of genetics within the populations and within the species that we like to consume, apples are a good example, the better off we'll be. And then the fourth one, which is real anthropocentric, is the idea that there are services that the environment provides for us, and biodiversity increases the potential for those services to be provided to us. And this is just a series of slides that shows what that looks like, right? So we need photosynthesis to provide food to eat. We need oxygen. We need nutrients to be cycled. We need water to be cycled so that we can clean the water so that we can have food to eat, and then that soil formation. These are all different things that services we need the ecosystems to provide so we can stay alive. And it's broken up into the different categories there: provisioning, regulating, and cultural ecosystem services. All right. The other big idea and reason that biodiversity is important is to provide community stability. So this is just a quick graphic that's showing that the more species we have, the more resilient a community will be. If you have time, go to this slide, watch this video about honeyguide birds. It's a really cool example of how human culture, the diversity of human culture, diversity of ecosystems, diversity of species, all come together to create really interesting relationships between species and their environment. But I'm going to cruise through it, right? It's about the people that live here, the Yao in Mozambique, and it's definitely worth your time. So go to the slideshow, take a look at it. All right, so we do need to acknowledge the fact that biodiversity is declining worldwide because humans are driving species extinct through habitat alteration, introduction of alien species, alterations in biogeochemical cycles, and hunting and harvesting, right? So this is just some graphs that show how species are going extinct. We've got habitat loss here. This map at the bottom just shows a small section of Brazil and how the habitat, the rainforest has been denuded, but I think one of the things that we often do is overly focus on the rainforest, so I also want to bring your attention to the northern forests of Canada and the United States are also being reduced in size, and we need to consider that as well. Right? We take a look at this map and we can see all of the areas all over the world where forest is being lost. All right. The other one is over harvesting. This is an example of the cod catch. So we see a peak in catch, but then the population crashes. We're seeing lots of examples of that oceanic fish. We've also got introduced species. Again, go take a look at this Asian carp video. If you don't know about the Asian carp, spend some time looking into those, but definite threat to biodiversity. We've also got pollution. Biomagnification is the idea that pollution moves up the food chain and not only threatens the things at the bottom of the food chain, but the organisms at the top. The good news is that this example here, DDT, DDT was banned, and we're seeing a huge return of birds of prey like osprey, eagles, hawks, falcons, all of the things that were affected by DDT. If you're looking for a book to read while you're at home, Silent Spring will maybe be depressing, but it'll give you hope because it had a huge impact. So you might want to check that out. Climate change, we're going to talk more about climate change, but this is definitely leading to a reduction in species diversity. So let's talk a little more optimistically about how we protect biodiversity. So 3 main ideas. 1, protection of habitat. 2, reduce harvesting of organisms from the wild. And 3, species reintroductions, right? So your project is going to focus on, your assignment is going to focus on habitat protection and national parks. So I'm going to just kind of cruise by this, but parks and reserves are a key piece to preserving biodiversity. Reduced harvesting, right? So this example is about elephant seals, but we've got lots of examples of different things that when we stopped removing them from the wild, their populations increased, which can often lead to an increase in other species. And then finally, we're at the active reintroduction of species into the environment. This is a tricky one for conservationists because what are we doing oftentimes active efforts to meddle in the ecosystems have not been as successful as people have thought they would be. There have been unintended consequences because people have failed to think systemically, but people seem to agree that reintroducing species that were once there is a good idea. The challenge is how far back are we going to go? If you want to look something up, Pleistocene rewilding is the idea that we need to bring back large carnivores and herbivores to the American grasslands. And so it's worth checking out. Okay, so I want to switch to your to-do list, right? So that's the lecture for today. And so now this is your to-do list. You need to read chapter 42. It focuses specifically on animal diversity. Before the break, we talked about plant diversity. You need to complete assignment 5, National Park Biodiversity, which I'm going to talk about for a second. And then I'm going to put it on you to read the updated instructions for the physiology project. I put those up on my courses. You need to take a look at them, figure out how things have changed. If you have questions, let me know. But that's due April 5th, and it's up to you to figure that out. All right, so I just want to talk a little bit about your assignment with the national parks. I've got some pictures here of the Smoky Mountains National Park, and what I'm asking you to is to choose a national park, right? There are lots of really interesting examples. I've got maps here. This is from Shenandoah's, a great one to look into. There's a map from Smoky Mountain National Park. Dinosaur National Park is cool. Acadia in Maine. Maybe some of you live near some of these places. You want to look a little deeper into them. Even places like Mammoth Cave are an interesting study. You could even look into the Martin Luther King Jr. National Park. It's in the middle of Atlanta, but there is definitely a diversity of species that live there, and also speaks to the diversity of ideas that drive our world forward. So what you need to do is choose a national park. You need to do an analysis of the biodiversity, ecosystem, species, and also its value as a cultural area, and kind of looking at things from an anthropocentric point of view. So you'll find assignment 5 on my courses. And if you have any questions with that, let me know. All right. Well, good luck with this, and have a good day.